Nevis is roughly conical in shape with a volcano known as Nevis Peak at its center. The island is fringed on its western and northern coastlines by sandy beaches composed of a mixture of white coral sand with brown and black sand eroded and washed down from the volcanic rocks that make up the island. The gently sloping coastal plain 0.62 mile wide has natural freshwater springs as well as non-potable volcanic hot springs, especially along the western coast. The island was named Owali, translated as Land of Beautiful Waters, by the Kalinago and Dulcina, Sweet Island, by the early British settlers. The name Nevis is derived from the Spanish phrase Nuestra Señora de las Nieves, which translates as Our Lady of the Snows. The name was given by its Spanish discoverers and first appeared on maps in the 16th century. Nevis is also known by the sobriquet Queen of the Caribbees, which it earned in the 18th century because of its many sugar plantations. Nevis is both geographically smaller and less populous than St. Kitts. It maintains significant autonomy within the Federation, including a separate government headed by the Premier of Nevis and a separate legislature. Nevis has twice voted, in 1977 and 1998, to secede from the Federation, but neither attempt succeeded. The majority of the approximately 12,000 Nevisians are of primarily African descent, with notable British, Portuguese, and Lebanese minority communities. English is the official language, and its literacy rate of 98% is one of the highest in the Western Hemisphere.
Nevis had been settled for more than 2,000 years by Amerindian people prior to having been sighted by Columbus in 1493. The indigenous people of Nevis during these periods belonged to the Leeward Island Amerindian groups popularly referred to as Arawaks and Kalinago, a complex mosaic of ethnic groups with similar culture and language. Dominican anthropologist Lennox Honeychurch traces the European use of the term Carib to refer to the Leeward Island Aborigines to Columbus, who picked it up from the Taínos on Hispaniola. It was not a name the Kalinago called themselves. Carib Indians was the generic name used for all groups believed involved in cannibalistic war rituals, more particularly, the consumption of parts of a killed enemy's body. The Amerindian name for Nevis was Owali, Land of Beautiful Waters. The structure of the Kalinago language has been linguistically identified as Arawakan. Despite the Spanish claim, Nevis continued to be a popular stop-over point for English and Dutch ships on their way to North America. Captain Bartholomew Gilbert of Plymouth visited the island in 1603, spending 2 weeks to cut 20 tons of lignum vitae wood. Gilbert sailed on to Virginia to seek out survivors of the Roanoke settlement in what is now North Carolina. Captain John Smith visited Nevis on his way to Virginia in 1607 on the voyage that founded Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in the New World. On August 30, 1620, King James I of England asserted sovereignty over Nevis by giving a royal patent for colonization to the Earl of Carlisle. However, actual European settlement did not happen until 1628, when Anthony Hilton moved from nearby St. Kitts following a murder plot against him. 80 other settlers accompanied him, soon boosted by a further 100 settlers from London who had initially hoped to settle Barbuda. Hilton became the first governor of Nevis. After the Treaty of Madrid 1670 between Spain and England, Nevis became the seat of the British colony, and the Admiralty Court also sat in Nevis. Between 1675 and 1730, the island was the headquarters for the slave trade for the Leeward Islands, with approximately 6,000 to 7,000 enslaved West Africans passing through en route to other islands each year. The Royal African Company brought all its ships through Nevis. A 1678 census shows a community of Irish people, 22% of the population, existing as either indentured servants or freemen. Due to the profitable slave trade and the high quality of Nevisian sugar cane, Nevis soon became a dominant source of wealth for Great Britain and the slave-owning British plantocracy. When the Leeward Islands were separated from Barbados in 1671, Nevis became the seat of the Leeward Islands colony and was given the nickname, Queen of the Caribbees. It remained the colonial capital for the Leeward Islands until the seat was transferred to Antigua for military reasons in 1698. During this period, Nevis was the richest of the British Leeward Isle.
Nevis outranked larger islands like Jamaica in sugar production in the late 17th century. The planters' wealth on the island is evident in the tax records preserved at the Calendar State Papers in the British Colonial Office Public Records, where the amount of tax collected on the Leeward Islands was recorded. The sums recorded for 1676 as head tax on the enslaved, a tax payable in sugar, amounted to £384,600 in Nevis, as opposed to $67,000 each in Antigua and St. Kitts, $62,500 in Montserrat, and $5,500 total in the other 5 islands. The profits on sugar cultivation in Nevis was enhanced by the fact that the cane juice from Nevis yielded an unusually high amount of sugar. A gallon 3.79 liters of cane juice from Nevis yielded 24 ounces 0.71 liters of sugar, whereas a gallon from St. Kitts yielded 16 ounces 0.47 liters. 20% of the British Empire's total sugar production in 1700 was derived from Nevisian plantations. Exports from West Indian colonies like Nevis were worth more than all the exports from all the mainland 13 colonies of North America combined at the time of the American Revolution. The enslaved families formed the large labor force required to work the sugar plantations. After the 1650s, the supply of white indentured servants began to dry up due to increased wages in England and less incentive to migrate to the colonies. By the end of the 17th century, the population of Nevis consisted of a small, wealthy planter elite in control, a marginal population of poor whites, a great majority of African descended, and an unknown number of Maroons, escaped living in the mountains. In 1780, 90% of the 10,000 people living on Nevis were black. Some of the Maroons joined with the few remaining Kalinago in Nevis to form a resistance force. Memories of the Nevisian Maroons' struggle under the plantation system are preserved in place names such as Maroon Hill, an early center of resistance. The great wealth generated by the colonies of the West Indies led to wars among Spain, Britain, and France. The formation of the United States can be said to be a partial byproduct of these wars, and the strategic trade aims that often ignored North America. 3 privateers, William Kidd being one of them, were employed by the British Crown to help protect ships in Nevis waters. During the 17th century, the French, based on St. Kitts, launched many attacks on Nevis, sometimes assisted by the Kalinago, who in 1667 sent a large fleet of canoes along in support. In the same year, a Franco-Dutch invasion fleet was repelled off Nevis by an English fleet. Letters and other records from the era indicate that the English on Nevis hated and feared the Amerindians. In 1674 and 1683, they participated in attacks on Kalinago villages in Dominica and St. Vincent, despite a lack of official approval from the Crown for the attack. On Nevis, the English built Fort Charles and a series of smaller fortifications to aid in defending the island. This included Saddle Hill Battery, built in 1740 to replace a deodand on Mount Nevis.
In 1706, Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville, the French-Canadian founder of Louisiana in North America, decided to drive the English out of Nevis and thus also stop pirate attacks on French ships. He considered Nevis the region's headquarters for piracy against French trade. During d'Iberville's invasion of Nevis, French buccaneers were used in the front line, infamous for being ruthless killers after the pillaging during the wars with Spain, where they gained a reputation for torturing and murdering non-combatants. In the face of the invading force, the English militiamen of Nevis fled. Some planters burned the plantations, rather than letting the French have them, and hid in the mountains. It was the enslaved Africans who held the French at bay by taking up arms to defend their families and the island. The enslaved quarters had been looted and burned as well, as the main reward promised the men fighting on the French side in the attack was the right to capture as many enslaved as possible and resell them in Martinique. During the fighting, 3,400 enslaved Nevisians were captured and sent off to Martinique, but about 1,000 more, poorly armed and militarily untrained, held the French troops at bay by a murderous fire, according to an eyewitness account by an English militiaman. He wrote that the enslaved brave behavior and defense there shamed what some of their masters did, and they do not shrink to tell us so. After 18 days of fighting, the French were driven off the island. Among the Nevisian men, women and children carried away on d'Iberville's ships, 6 ended up in Louisiana, the first persons of African descent to arrive there.
One consequence of the French attack was a collapsed sugar industry, and during the ensuing hardship on Nevis, small plots of land on the plantations were made available to the enslaved families in order to control the loss of life due to starvation. With less profitability for the absentee plantation owners, the import of food supplies for the plantation workers dwindled. Between 1776 and 1783, when the food supplies failed to arrive altogether due to the rebellion in North America, 300 to 400 enslaved Nevisians starved to death. On August 1, 1834, slavery was abolished in the British Empire. In Nevis, 8,815 enslaved were freed. The first Monday in August is celebrated as Emancipation Day and is part of the annual Nevis Culturama Festival. A 4-year apprenticeship program followed the abolishment of slavery on the plantations. In spite of the continued use of the labor force, the Nevisian slave owners were paid over $150,000 in compensation from the British government for the loss of property, whereas the enslaved families received nothing for 200 years of labor. One of the wealthiest planter families in Nevis, the Pennies of Montravers Plantation, claimed $36,396, equivalent to $3,721,559 in 2021, in compensation for the enslaved on the family-owned plantations around the Caribbean. Because of the early distribution of plots and because many of the planters departed from the island when sugar cultivation became unprofitable, a relatively large percentage of Nevisians already owned or controlled land at emancipation. Others settled on Crown land. This early development of a society with a majority of small, landowning farmers and entrepreneurs created a stronger middle class in Nevis than in St. Kitts, where the sugar industry continued until 2006. Even though the 15 families in the wealthy planter elite no longer control the arable land, St. Kitts still has a large, landless working-class population.
The population had reached 7,470 by 1842. Nevis was united with St. Kitts and Anguilla in 1882, and they became an associated state with full internal autonomy in 1967, though Anguilla seceded in 1971. Together, St. Kitts and Nevis became independent on September 19, 1983. On August 10, 1998, a referendum on Nevis to separate from St. Kitts had 2,427 votes in favor and 1,498 against, falling short of the two-thirds majority needed. Before 1967, the local government of St. Kitts was also the government of Nevis and Anguilla. Nevis had 2 seats and Anguilla 1 seat in the government. The economic and infrastructural development of the 2 smaller islands was not a priority to the colonial federal government. When the hospital in Charlestown was destroyed in a hurricane in 1899, planting of trees in the squares of St. Kitts and refurbishing of government buildings, also in St. Kitts, took precedence over the rebuilding of the only hospital in Nevis. After 5 years without any proper medical facilities, the leaders in Nevis initiated a campaign, threatening to seek independence from St. Kitts. The British administrator in St. Kitts, Charles Cox, was unmoved. He stated that Nevis did not need a hospital since there had been no significant rise in the number of deaths during the time Nevisians had been without a hospital. Therefore, no action was needed on behalf of the government, and besides, Cox continued, the Legislative Council regarded Nevis and Anguilla as a drag on St. Kitts and would willingly see a separation. A letter of complaint to the Metropolitan British Foreign Office gave result, and the federal government in St. Kitts was ordered by their superiors in London to take speedy action. The Legislative Council took another 5 years to consider their options. The final decision by the federal government was to not rebuild the old hospital after all, but to instead convert the old government house in Nevis into a hospital, named Alexandra Hospital after Queen Alexandra, wife of King Edward VII. A majority of the funds assigned for the hospital could thus be spent on the construction of a new official residence in Nevis.
After d'Iberville's invasion in 1704, records show Nevis' sugar industry in ruins and a decimated population begging the English Parliament and relatives for loans and monetary assistance to stave off island-wide starvation. The sugar industry on the island never fully recovered, and during the General Depression that followed the loss of the West Indian sugar monopoly, Nevis fell on hard times, and the island became one of the poorest in the region. The island remained poorer than St. Kitts until 1991, when the fiscal performance of Nevis edged ahead of the fiscal performance of St. Kitts for the first time since the French invasion. Electricity was introduced in Nevis in 1954 when 2 generators were shipped in to provide electricity to the area around Charlestown. In this regard, Nevis fared better than Anguilla, where there were no paved roads, no electricity and no telephones until 1967. However, electricity did not become available island-wide on Nevis until 1971. An ambitious infrastructure development program was introduced in the early 2000s, which included a transformation of the Charlestown port, construction of a new deep-water harbor, resurfacing and widening the island main road, a new airport terminal and control tower, and a major airport expansion, which required the relocation of an entire village in order to make room for the runway extension. Modernized classrooms and better equipped schools, as well as improvements in the educational system, have contributed to a leap in academic performance on the island. The pass rate among the Nevisian students sitting for the Caribbean Examination Council CXC exams, the Cambridge General Certificate of Education Examination GCE, and the Caribbean Advanced Proficiency Examinations is now consistently among the highest in the English-speaking Caribbean.